What I want to emphasize is that monetary policies in the US have been a catastrophe for the US itself because they didn't lead to industrial production growth and capital spending over the next 10 years or employment gains. There are less people employed in the US today than 10 years ago. But it led to a boom in emerging economies. And because of the Chinese incremental demand to meet the demand from the United States for its consumption, the crude oil outlays, and this does not only apply to crude oil but also to other commodities, went up. Now you have to think, 1980 to 2001, commodity prices go down. So the resource producers of the world produce and sell is going down in price. What they're buying is still going up in price because we had disinflation but not deflation. So we call that a worsening terms of trade. After 2001, the outlays in the world for crude oil and also iron ore, copper and agriculture commodities go up substantially because price increases and demand increase. And so the world, instead of spending just $500 billion as in 1998 for crude oil, now suddenly spends in the summer of 2008 $4 trillion. You have to see what change that meant for the resource producers of Latin America, Africa, Central Asia, the Middle East and Australasia. That was a huge bonanza, and so these countries went out and could buy consumer goods, expand their capacities and bought capital goods, and we had a global boom. And this has meant, I'm not saying that US monetary policy were only responsible for a shift in the balance of economic power in the world, but they certainly accelerated it. For the first time ever, you have car sales in emerging economies exceeding car sales in the US, Europe and Japan. And car sales in China exceed now US car sales substantially. They may be subsidized, yeah, correct, but you can see the trend is clearly up, and here the trend is at best flat, and here they were also subsidized, by the way. And also importantly, the oil consumption in emerging economies for the first time exceeds oil consumption in the developed world, here, and also the oil consumption in emerging economies is still growing, whereas in the developed world is contracting. I'm only mentioning this because I think in the Western world, people still look at emerging economies as being their poor cousins. Yeah, it is true that the GDP per capita of India and Vietnam is $1,000 per annum, and that we in the Western world have GDP per capita, I don't know, $40,000. But because 80% of the world's population lives in emerging economies, in aggregate, the demand is of course huge. In 2009, they sold 120 million new mobile phone subscriptions and mobile phones. These are markets that are not yet saturated and growing very rapidly. And here, just as another example, semiconductor sales in Asia, ex-Japan, so it's Asia without Japan, are larger than semiconductor sales in the US, Europe and Japan combined. All I want to tell you, yesterday I was sitting next to someone at the dinner. He said he's never invested overseas. I can't believe this. Nowadays, everyone should have at least 50% of his assets outside the developed world. I'm not saying that you have to rush and place your orders with Goldman Sachs to be executed on Monday morning. But I'm saying that in terms of the world, we live in a different world where emerging economies, as a percent of the world, are now at least 50% or more. In goods market, in many goods market, much more. It is true that the US consumer is still the largest consumer in the world. But let me tell you something about statistics. When you measure consumption in the Western world, about 60% of consumption or 70% are service related. If we just look at the goods markets, cars and mobile phones and TV sets and so forth, then of course in countries like China with 1.3 billion people, you have much larger goods markets than in the US with 330 million people, should be clear. Same for India. Plus, in the Western world, the consumer is over-leveraged, over 100% debt, household debt to GDP. In a country like Vietnam, where only 10% of the people have a bank account, how much leverage do you think there is? There's no credit card. When people buy a house, they go and pay with gold coins or gold bars. So this is a different situation. We have unsaturated markets and we have favorable demographics. The other point I'd like to make about all the deflationist talk is, if you look at the growth of international reserves from $1 trillion here in 1995 to now $8.5 trillion, that is a symptom of inflation. It's a clear symptom that there is an excess liquidity in the system. And when the German finance minister says the markets are out of control, I have to say the central banks are out of control in terms of printing money and letting credit growth occur. That is out of control. The markets are not out of control. And by the way, the central banks never say markets are out of control when they go up. They only say when they're going down. So, I mean, something is wrong in their attitude. Now I have to accelerate this because we're running late. Basically, as I mentioned, I think that all of you have to allocate a larger portion of your assets to emerging economies. I'm not saying that you have to do it tomorrow, because I think that we have a lot of social issues that are still impending, and a lot of problems will still occur. But in general, that would be my idea, to shift assets gradually overseas, and also to have the custody of assets overseas. Because one day, you won't be able to get your money out of the jurisdiction you're in. That should be very clear. I'm not only talking about the US there. In Asia, and I'm not talking here about performances of stocks, I think what will drive economic growth is basically a low level of urbanization. In India, there's still 700 million people living in the countryside. In China, urbanization has picked up a lot. There's about 20 million people moving to cities every year. That requires the construction of new cities, the infrastructure, the transportation equipment, and so forth and so on. So that leads to some inherent economic growth. I'm not saying that stocks will go up because of that, but I think we'll have some growth in Asia longer term. The other point I'd like to make about this shift in the balance of economic power, it's remarkable how fast it has occurred. Because if you look at economic history, say the 19th century, the deindustrialization of India, and colonialism, at that time it took still 4 months until the construction of the Suez Canal to send news or people or goods from London to Asia. Now you can do it overnight, and you have instant communication and so forth. So one of the consequences is obviously that the industrialization and the shift in the balance of power can occur at a much faster pace. Just as an example here, you have steel production in China as a percent of world steel production, from 10% in 1990 to 44% at the present time. Aluminum from 10% in year 2000 to 33% today, in 10 years' time, from 10% to 33%. This in economic history has never happened before. And this leads to increased, obviously, economic and financial volatility, and also, of course, to tensions around the world. Now, I have to return back to the view that the whole world depends on the US consumer. Here, you have exports of China to the developed countries. They went down as a percent of total exports from 48% down to 38%. Whereas exports from China to emerging economies have gone from 42% here to 48%, but they exclude Eastern European exports and so forth. So if you added those to it, then the exports from China to the emerging world will be 60% of total exports. So yes, the US is still a very large market, but it's not growing anymore, whereas here the growth to emerging markets is very strong, and the world's economic system is now much more China and emerging economy centric than it was before, when it was very US centric. Now, in terms of commodities, China will obviously not stop buying iron ore and copper and oil, because on a percentage or on a per capita basis they have very little. And their per capita consumption, including India, is very small. In China, 2 barrels per annum. Per capita in India is 0.8 barrels compared to 17 here in Japan and South Korea, 25 in the US. So I think it's fair to say that the demand in China and India and the rest of Asia will continue to go up. And in the meantime, expenditures on oil explorations have gone up substantially, but production is flat. And also the marginal cost of getting new oil has been up. It's now around $70. And whereas geologists will debate whether we have peak oil or not peak oil, everybody agrees on one thing: the world consumes more oil than they add new reserves annually. So essentially the oil reserves, the proven reserves, are going down. And so I believe that over time prices will rather go up. And this is something to also consider. I mean, if someone had shown me the picture of a burning Bangkok a year ago, I would have said, I don't believe it. But it happened. Sometimes political events and regulatory changes and social conditions can have a huge impact on asset markets. And all I want to say is, in the 70s, the US was still over 70% oil self-sufficient. And now it imports over 75% of its oil requirements. And in the case of China, here you have the reserves going down, the production is flat, and here the demand is up. After 1994, they became oil importers. And so the US and the Chinese are here in the Middle East, obviously, because of oil. And you have to see, for China, this is a top priority. The US has a huge strategic advantage in the sense that the US can source oil. First of all, they have access to 2 seas, the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, and they can source oil from Canada and from Mexico and Venezuela and Ecuador, and from the west coast of Africa and from the North Sea and the Middle East. The Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Taiwanese, they source essentially all the oil, 95% here from the Middle East. They come here through the Strait of Malacca, and then up here the Vietnamese coast, past the southern tip of Taiwan, and then to Japan and the northern ports of China and Korea. So the Chinese are highly vulnerable to an interruption of oil supplies here from the Middle East, whereas the US is less vulnerable. And it's a priority for the Chinese to essentially become oil and other resource sufficient in terms of having secure supplies for the future. So they're building a pipeline here through Myanmar. Of course, the American embargo of Myanmar helps the Chinese. And they also have built a pipeline or financed a pipeline in Russia to their border. And they have built a pipeline here into Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and for gas to Turkmenistan. But the point I really like to make is the Chinese, yes, they have access to the East and South China Sea here, but they're surrounded by American military and naval bases, and the US has 11 aircraft carriers. The Chinese don't have one, whereby the Chinese have very efficient submarines that can probably sink them all. But yeah, I mean, this is new war techniques. But essentially, it should be clear that it's not in the interest of the Chinese to have American bases here, because then they are really encircled with the Americans, with the American bases here in the Pacific. So I think that tensions will go up. The Russians, by the way, have no interest to have American bases here because they're also encircled by America. And over time, I think the tensions will go up. By the